Welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Mark Silver. I provide forensic evaluations for immigration, criminal, and civil litigation lawyers in the United States. I've done thousands of cases, tens and tens of thousands of people throughout the United States have had the opportunity to listen to my CLE programs, but I'm putting them now on YouTube so that they're all going to be available for free. Today's topic is something that is quite unique and difficult to evaluate for immigration defense lawyers. It is sexual orientation asylum petitions, and the subtopic today is challenges in forensic psychosocial immigration evaluations. In other words, looking at the respondent's sexual orientation asylum claim and understanding the clinical issues and the challenges because of that particular person. There are two books which I really want to hawk, as always. One is Psychosocial Evaluations. The reason I always recommend this book, even though it was originally intended for civil litigation lawyers, is that it's crucial that we understand how to evaluate people. This is something that's almost completely neglected in our law school classes. Someone comes in and, what do you do? How do you approach the person? How do you elicit information, particularly if the person's anxious or doesn't feel a sense of trust? It's so crucial in personal injury cases, family law cases, and of course, other areas including criminal and immigration defense work, because our clients have been traumatized, they've suffered in ways that are sometimes unimaginable. And this book, which I will show you again, has many advantages in that it has one very long chapter that outlines how clinical evaluations are undertaken. So it's not just that you could refer someone for a clinical forensic evaluation for an immigration case as an immigration lawyer, but that as an attorney, you can also get a sense of what questions to ask, what the challenges are in these kinds of evaluations, and what kinds of things might help make the client feel more at ease. The other book, which is also very, very central, is Handbook of Mitigation in Criminal and Immigration Forensics. Please get the 7th chapter. I promise you these are the 2 cheapest books you're ever going to buy. But this book has a chapter on every major CLE that I have done in the United States for immigration defense lawyers. There's also quite a bit for criminal lawyers, but that's another issue. And that includes a specific chapter on our topic today of sexual orientation asylum petitions. So let's jump right into it. I just want to say at the outset, I always try to integrate theory with practice. Please, for this or for any other program, don't hesitate to email me. I'll send you back a redacted copy. Please put the name of the CLE or the program in the subject line that I've done. And just so I know it's a real email, of course, and that it's not spam, please put in the body of the email your information, your signature, your address, phone number. I will not send you spam. I promise. I have no interest, but I want to make sure it's a real person who's sending me this, and I will send you back a redacted copy of a case in the particular area that we're talking about. Or if it's just to ask a question or to get any feedback about a particular area that I'm lecturing on, please feel free to reach out. I work in many different areas as a forensic expert. I've done countless VAWA cases, I-751, deportation, removal, all different kinds of waiver cases, U visas, detention, out in Walsh Act, competency evaluations. I think, and I've said this many times, I think I'm the only criminal mitigation expert in the United States for immigration defense lawyers. That is, the only expert who considers mitigating circumstances for clients who have committed felonies, CIMTs, misdemeanors, but also those who've come in through fraud or misrepresentation, how to mitigate that even in the context of a waiver where you're still trying to prove extreme hardship for qualifying family members. However, I say that as an introduction because this particular issue sexual orientation asylum petitions are really very unique. And that's the first thing I want to get into. They're unique because the asylum case pertains not simply to persecution, like in other asylum cases, that the client, the respondent, may have experienced in his country of origin, but the client also experienced persecution often within his own community and within his own family, and even internally. It affects how he feels about himself, how he understands himself. It affects his self-concept, self-esteem, and so on. As a result, the clients in these kinds of asylum petitions experience pathological development of identity and self and so on. And it fundamentally impacts their psychological well-being, their emotional health, and it leads to potentially a wide range of psychiatric issues and consequences. From this, we have to understand that the persecution that these asylum petitioners experience is systemic in nature and affects every part of their life. It affects them personally, their family, their educational pursuits, vocational interests, hobbies, interests, religious affiliation, and much, much more. That's the single most important thing to understand from these sexual orientation asylum claims, that they are unique for these three core reasons. Clearly, other asylum cases have some of these elements, but not with this kind of sensitivity and not with this kind of depth. The elements for an asylum claim, of course, are based on sexual orientation, in this case, which is a well-founded fear of persecution based on past persecution or risk of persecution in the future if the client returns to his country of origin because of his membership in his particular social group. The persecutor must be the government or a group of individuals that the government is either unwilling or perhaps unable to control. There is a wide range of evidence that is usually garnered in asylum cases because they can be so challenging. The one thing I would say, and I think I might have this later on in the lecture, but the one crucial issue is that in many of these sexual orientation asylum petitions, the evidence is very personal. It's very internal. It affects, the most intimate elements of the client's identity, sexual and otherwise. And as a result, it can be very difficult to elicit this information from the client, and equally difficult to have this client coherently provide this kind of information in testimony form in the context of immigration court. When the individual experiences ridicule and abuse by family, developing a healthy and normal sexual identity becomes almost impossible. Identity formation often begins with confusion, and through comparison with one's peers, tolerance for one's sexual identity and identity in general slowly emerges such that the individual can feel good about his identity, his sense of self, sexually and otherwise. Identity confusion becomes a pathway to lifelong self-doubt and fear rather than a healthy doorway towards maturity in later adolescence and adulthood. If greater self-understanding and self-awareness does not emerge, pathology often follows in the form of low self-esteem and poor self-concept, which can cause lifelong psychological strife. In societies where being gay is considered deviant by law and social norms, healthy gay development is extremely challenging, if not impossible. This is especially true where the individual has noted that older gays have suffered fewer opportunities in the community due to discrimination, bias, and prejudice, and so on. At some point, the client early in his life becomes even more aware of atypical interests, particularly if that person becomes sexually aroused in the context of same-sex activities such as physical education at school and so on. And sexual experimentation with peers is really quite common during adolescence. The individual becomes aware that such feelings are uncommon and viewed negatively by society, and the person feels shame about their feelings and their thoughts and so on. The individual may even encounter a sense of imminent danger for the first time in his life. Even if the individual does not pursue same-sex encounters, prejudiced peers may pick up on nuanced behavioral cues from the individual. The individual may judge himself quite harshly, assume that his feelings are deviant, and berate himself with shame for sexual thoughts and fantasies. Such fantasies can rarely be easily eliminated, such that the shame only grows in silence. Sexual activity for gays in persecutory societies must be secretive and undertaken with considerable caution. Even when individuals are careful, it is not unusual for couples who are intimately connected to brush one another, hold hands, or extend a warm touch. Yet any of these can be indications to onlookers about possibly gay activity. All this makes the person quite guarded, such that some people develop a latent paranoia and pervasive distrust and suspiciousness of others and other people's motives, so that almost everything is interpreted as potentially malevolent. Clients may present with both gay and heterosexual experiences. This does not need to undermine the client's underlying petition or claims of persecution, and the mental health professional should be diligent in presenting a psychosocial history for the reader regarding the client's sexual development, intimacy explorations, and interpersonal pathways. Many years ago, when I started to do these cases and consult for lawyers and clients on these cases, I was approached with clients who presented with bisexuality. We understand in the world of mental health what is normative development, but in the world of immigration courts and adjudicators, some of them were scratching their heads trying to understand how someone who claimed at one point to be gay is now bisexual, or perhaps a person who was bisexual earlier in their life is now gay, and so on. We now understand about sexual fluidity in a much more, I think, healthy manner, but non-healthcare professionals are not very much aware of this. And please be aware that your client has grown up in a family or community or religious society where this certainly would have been completely foreign. Your client as a youth, as a gay youth, perhaps in his country of origin, may have developed strategies to psychologically and physically defend himself from deviant thoughts and feelings. He may have attempted to not deny his being gay outright, or even abuse others by joining peers who target vulnerable gay adolescents. Perhaps he would become socially isolated and protect himself by minimal interaction with peers, or finding a safe place in which to create a private domain. You may find destructive and self-injurious behavior, such as drug use, impulsive conduct issues, promiscuous behavior, petty criminal behavior, truancy, and antisocial conduct. And yet there are others who become very goal-oriented, who may strive toward perfectionism in academics or athletics and so on, using this as a cover to deal with their social issues, their anxiety, and much else. Similarly, there are outlets for anxiety in non-persecutory communities. A person may avoid his sexual identity altogether by avoiding school dances, parties, and similar social settings so as not to put himself in the position of having to feel uncomfortable or appear awkward or different. Others may seek mental health professionals, however. The person may seek to refrain from topics concerning gay thoughts and feelings and concentrate on feelings of depression, anxiety, and so on, to avoid sexuality altogether. Others may date or even marry opposite-sex partners to avoid gossip, perhaps hoping to be cured or simply to satisfy a deep-seated need to fit into family and community. Others believe that remaining celibate will somehow address such personal issues, and turns to spirituality perhaps and even religious institutions with the hope of eliminating sexual thoughts. A sense of home and community is also vital for normal, healthy growth, development, and psychological well-being. And many of our clients in sexual orientation cases have come from societies where this was simply not available. It is often the case that the father in such homes is totally unaccepting, while the mother may adopt a more benign approach and provide a modicum of solace to the child, allowing him to understand that while his behaviors are deemed wrong, he is still loved. Why we have this split is not clear, but part of the answer, I believe, is that in many of these cases that I've seen, the respondent, the client, has grown up in a religious home in his country of origin, and the father is often very affiliated, particularly in Muslim countries, with the mosque, where there is, a close contact not just for religious services, but as a community center. And the father feels very ashamed or very put upon or fearful that, having a son who is gay may harm his entire family, maybe his profession, his other children, and so on. I want to speak now a little bit about harms themselves, because similar to VAWA cases and U visa cases, harms must be understood broadly and also systemically. First, physical harms. While it's important to consider, obviously, physical harms that your client has suffered in his country of origin, don't forget non-physical harms. A non-physical harm is something that physically harms the person indirectly. A very common example I see in VAWA cases are victims who are not physically harmed directly, but the abuser throws plates or glasses or menaces the victim in such a way that the victim feels physical harm. Another example is being sequestered. I see quite frequently victims in VAWA cases who are locked out of the home in the middle of winter at 2 o'clock in the morning. Well, that's a physical harm. You may not have been beaten or slapped. You may not have had your hair pulled or scratched, but it's a physical harm. And my concern is that sometimes in the asylum cases, indirect physical harm is not accounted for. Psychological and emotional harm is obviously important. They're quite similar, but they have differences. In these areas, we consider coercion, control, and manipulation in terms of passive harms, but there can also be active psychological and emotional harms in different ways. There could be unfair prosecution or disproportionate punishment for a criminal offense that the client may have experienced in his country of origin. There may have been verbal threats of death or injury or threats to the person's physical integrity. There may be community harms and religious restrictions where the person can't go to their church or temple. There could be sexual harms, very obviously, in various ways, where perhaps the client is not prohibited from interacting with friends or even sexual partners. There can be, obviously, within the realm of education, physical, emotional, psychological, verbal bullying in school. There may be limitations academically in that the person may not be able to advance or take certain classes or even to attend class at all. There may be economic persecution and harm in terms of what kind of job the person can or cannot obtain. I've seen many cases with criminal extortion or even robbery. I see actually a lot of extortion cases in VAWA that is not properly documented until I see the client. And a very typical example occurs where, the abuser will say, "Give me $500 because if you don't, I promise I'm going to report you to DHS and you'll be deported and you'll be separated from your child." Well, that's criminal extortion. And I see clients in their asylum petitions rarely writing about this, but when I do the evaluation, I will sometimes hear about it in a careful interview. Obviously, there can be harm not only to the individual, but the individual in relation to friends and his group of a group of friends in his country of origin. There could be community restrictions. So the only thing I would say about this is think about harm broadly and systemically. Think about how it affects a person's everyday life, their ability to really enjoy their lives, the quality of their lives. Are there basic human right privations? Are there legal deprivations, nutritional, physical, sensory deprivations? Are there sleep deprivations? I once had a case where someone was being harassed in their home, and the home was never broken into. There was never physical harm or direct contact with the home. But this person would have these people outside of the home drive him crazy night after night, so he couldn't sleep, and therefore he couldn't go to school, he couldn't go to work. It really fundamentally interfered with his quality of life. There can be all sorts of privations that the person occurs that are under the category of harm. There can be more serious physical issues such as confinement, kidnapping, torture, beatings. Obviously, if there is sexual harm, it needs to be discussed in a very sensitive way with your client. But on the other hand, you don't want to miss anything. You want the client to feel sufficiently at ease that they're able to speak openly and provide sufficient detail to document what they've experienced. Threats must not be underestimated. Threats of violence are generally not sufficient, I understand, to establish past persecution unless the threats themselves cause significant harm. And it's for that reason you always need to, if possible, connect specific instances of harm with the resultant psychological or emotional damage that the person suffers, or even psychiatric issues. It's important to consider subjectively and objectively how these matters exist through the client's narrative. If the client seems to not be harping on or making a big deal about something specific, it could be because they're trying to not flesh it out because it's terribly shameful and painful. It could be that the client experienced something that he thought was normative or normal in his country of origin. There could be many reasons, but it's important to look at red flags and any hint of harm to have it fleshed out. It's also important for this reason not to rely on the client's narrative alone, but rather to actually, hit every kind of harm that I've mentioned, and even others perhaps, and ask the client about them directly. Similarly, I do this in other kind of harm cases with U visas, and I do harm cases for civil litigation and so on. But for VAWA cases, there's several categories I look at, and whether or not the client volunteers information about it, I always inquire. It's important to consider both individual instances of harm then, but also patterns of harm that the person may have suffered over a long period of time. The reason I say this is because, similar to VAWA cases, you have to understand how many times and when these cases occur, when these instances of harm occur. In other words, the who, what, where, when, and why. And I'll give you just a very classic example. I've seen many cases where the person experiences most of the persecution, to be perfectly honest, in their family of origin. And it slowly emerges because of their sexuality, their behaviors, thoughts, and feelings as they grow into adolescence, attend school, and so on. And access the community in various ways. But then one day, the child is 14, 15 in school and is developing a crush on his classmate, and they hold hands, or they engage in some kind of intimacy that's age appropriate, and other boys see it. Because it's in public, there's a particular kind of shame that client may have suffered at that moment, which is particularly devastating, even though the other boys who saw this may not have been physically responsive or even emotionally responsive or even verbally degrading. In other words, this is a client who maybe for years and years suffered all sorts of verbal and emotional harm from his parents and siblings and his family of origin growing up because of his sexual orientation. But this was particularly damaging at this moment because it occurred in public when other boys in his class were looking at him. So understanding individual instances of harm versus systemic harm versus context, while considering subjective and objective criteria, is crucial to a more complete understanding of the person's history. I want to talk a little bit about mental health issues. Many, if not all of these clients have suffered PTSD. I've talked about PTSD in other programs, but I'll just mention it briefly here. The basic definition is that the person has been exposed to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence. This definition sounds narrow, but I can guarantee you that when the physical, emotional, psychological integrity of the person, their sense of safety and security is undermined, their sense of stability, you have PTSD. Moreover, this is very subjective, and the client in his country of origin, while he may not be relating a narrative that sounds harrowing to you, it may have been very life-threatening from his subjective experience at that point in time. As a result, many of these clients persistently re-experience what they've suffered through nightmares and in other ways. One very classic example, I had a client who was terribly harassed by soldiers in their country of origin in West Africa. The client came here, and every time he saw an NYPD officer on the streets of New York, he became panic-stricken. And the officers didn't approach him, they didn't ask any questions. It was because he associated the military uniform that the soldier wore in West Africa to the police uniforms that the NYPD officer was wearing here, to threats to his safety. That's a very good example of how something can trigger memories in a very different context, in a different country altogether, at a different point in the person's life, and the person remains quite traumatized here. Many of these clients will persistently avoid distressing trauma-related stimuli. They may become, they may experience negative alterations in cognitions and mood. And many of these clients present with different symptoms that are very similar to depression and anxiety for this reason. And their arousal and reactivity can be quite important to note. For example, many of these clients really become very guarded and hypervigilant about their surroundings. I had a case many years ago, I'll never forget. He came from a terrible human rights situation to New York City, and I'd ask him about his history as a gay man and his feeling in New York of feeling obviously more secure away from what he experienced where he had come from. And it turned out he wasn't living in New York City at all, but upstate New York in a small town. And I asked him, had he considered living in New York, because there's a large gay community here, and quite frankly, there were many social services here. He needed mental health support, and he was quite isolated and so on. And the client said he would never move to New York because there was a large gay community. And it was a real case, but he was basically saying that, integrating into the gay community in New York triggered for him very, very negative memories of what he experienced in his country of origin, and he simply couldn't tolerate it. It was too overwhelming for him. Many clients suffer, obviously, depression with hopelessness, helplessness, low energy, anhedonia, low self-esteem. It affects mood, appetite, sleep patterns, focus, and so on. The last point is very important because that also means that it can affect one's ability to concentrate and focus and remember. And when you're very depressed and you have to go to immigration court and provide a very clear narrative, answer questions, and assist your lawyer, it can be very, very challenging and even daunting. And lawyers, and I have this in a previous program I've put on YouTube, should always consider in those cases if there's a competency issue at heart. And if there is, look at the criteria and maybe get an evaluation for the client. Many of these clients end up with feelings of worthlessness and self-blame, even guilt, shame. Some of these clients, feel terrible that they've put their family through having lived with them in their childhood and teenage years. The child obviously, your client as a child obviously did nothing wrong, but I've seen many clients that feel a sense of guilt that, their parents were so embarrassed about them, or that their siblings could not participate in the community or the school in the way they would have wanted because of the client's sexuality. Please be aware that, chronic feelings of despair and deep psychological pain are key red flags of suicidality. And active suicidality and passive suicidality should be asked about. Active suicidality occurs where a person has a direct plan to kill themselves through perhaps ingesting pills. Passive suicidality often occurs where the person says, gee, I wonder what it would be like if I could sleep and sleep and sleep so I don't wake up, so I'll be dead, so all my psychological pain will vanish. Please be aware that some of these clients come to the United States and feel great about themselves, feeling free and working on their asylum case. But many of these clients have internalized a profound sense of self-hatred. They may feel useless. They may feel they've been a burden to themselves or their family members. It may be very difficult for them to develop reciprocal, healthy sexual or even platonic connections with others in their community. A very crucial issue is borderline personality disorder, and I know that many immigration defense lawyers don't consider this, but it's not uncommon for individuals who suffered systemic abuse, persecution, and so on in their country of origin, particularly because of their sexual orientation or identity. Borderline personality disorder, I've written a book on it, which I'll hopefully look at it in another CLE or YouTube program, although I have a few CLEs on it. Borderline personality disorder really is characterized by frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. There are patterns of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation. There can be identity disturbance and unstable self-image for the client, impulsivity in various ways, including perhaps cutting oneself or binge eating, substance abuse, reckless driving. Many have recurrent suicidal ideation. There can be emotional instability with highs and lows of moods. There can be chronic feelings of emptiness, inappropriate and intense anger, irritability, and also transient psychosis. Another major area is that some of these clients present with body dysmorphic disorder, that is imagined appearance defects with marked and excessive concern by the clients. This is particularly crucial where gay discrimination in the family community necessarily deems the young gay's behavior as deviant, as ugly, and as unwanted. In other words, the client then internalizes a very negative self-image, and it's not a stretch to understand that the client then understands their physical appearance and their presentation as something outside of what is normal. It's crucial to understand that many of these clients are psychotic. They've had to be paranoid to adapt and protect themselves in their country of origin. They can be very guarded and suspicious and paranoid. They don't have trust. They may hold grudges against other people. And it may really preclude them from adequately providing a narrative or working on their immigration case. Another form of psychosis besides delusions, which are false beliefs, are hallucinations, which are false perceptions. And again, many clients, if you really ask, they present with hallucinations. I'll ask, for example, do you sometimes find yourself walking down the street, you hear your name being called, but nobody's there? Well, the client grew up in a community with persecution, and so he developed these hypersensitive kind of senses for self-protection, and they are delusional in nature and some are perceptual in nature, but that's what you have to do in that kind of context. And it's important to ask about, not only to understand the client's psychiatric history, but it reflects the reality and the depth of the human rights violations that the person suffered before coming here and the consequent effects. As a result of many of these things, many clients also present with somatic issues, that is, bodily issues. And I always ask, like I say, has overwhelming anxiety over the years affected your body? How does your body react to overwhelming anxiety? And there's 3 or 4 huge areas that often comes up. They'll say, I have tummy problems or diarrhea or upset stomach a lot or dermatological problems. 3rd, loss of hair. And 4, recurrent migraines or headaches. Some clients in situations of persecution develop dissociative disorders, which are conditions that involve disruptions or breakdowns of memory, awareness, identity, or perception. People with dissociative disorders use dissociation as a defense mechanism psychologically and involuntarily. But there's 2 other things to really understand. When flight and fight are not available, then there may be fawning and freezing. The typical flight is if you see a bear in the woods, you run. The typical fight is you see a bear in the woods and you fight. Obviously, there's situations where there's an immediate threat and you cannot use flight. You can't run away. You're not going to run away from the bear. The bear's going to outrun you. And you cannot fight the bear. There's 2 other issues. One is called fawning, the other is called freezing. Fawning occurs where you essentially have an immediate threat and you placate the threat through behaviors, through mimicking the threat, verbally and so on. You're making nice so that the threat becomes less of a threat. The second is freezing, which basically means that you literally freeze, hoping that the threat does not notice you, so it moves away or it moves around you. You stay as still as possible in order to protect yourself. I just want to mention a few major challenges in these psychosocial evaluations for these kinds of cases. One is that the individual may have experienced physical and emotional abuse even in his family of origin. And so it's important to normalize the process as much as possible. In other words, first talk a little generally about the person's life in the United States, their hobbies, their interests, what they're doing. Going right into very painful memories can be very jarring. Second, it's important to remember that the abuse and persecution that the person suffered in their country of origin was probably systemic in nature, and the psychosocial history is going to uncover persecution, often in unsuspecting areas. And that's why it's so important to talk about everything. In other words, the client may initially say, no, I didn't have any problems in school, but ask some questions. Was there bullying? Was there a restriction in which classes could you attend? Maybe you felt very uncomfortable playing sports or participating in athletics because you were nervous. And then the client says, yeah, that's true. and it just makes the narrative more complete. Many of these clients have failed to seek mental health care for many reasons. Psychiatric care may be anathema to their cultural background. Mental health diagnoses are stigmatized. They may not have the resources. They may feel shameful. They may not think that anybody could possibly understand the unspeakable human rights violations that they've experienced. Many clients may think that speaking about these things will bring out a level of shame that will be overwhelming for them, or they'll feel stigmatized. Discrepancies in memory occur whenever anyone repeats a narrative, even about something that it can be objectively understood. In other words, if someone repeats a narrative again and again, there will be discrepancies. And it's important to work with the client and formulate a narrative that the client is able to not only say is and approve as, correct, but that the client is able to work with if they need to present that narrative outside of your office or outside of my office in perhaps immigration court. Again, recounting these very painful issues is at times overwhelming for clients, and it's important to appreciate and be very sensitive to that. And I know that immigration defense lawyers who do asylum work are, in fact, very sensitive to that. In cases of asylum, there is often no pattern to the abuse that the victim suffers. And it's important to understand that there's actually greater psychological harm when there's no pattern. Why? Because we need certainty in our life, and when there's no predictability or certainty and harm occurs, we suffer greater, not less psychological harm, greater, not less psychological stress. The obverse of this is, for example, in a spousal abuse case, I'll see cases where the abusing husband does not show any signs of physical menacing or harm towards the victim during the week. Friday afternoon comes around, he gets his paycheck, he goes to the bar, he's drinking for several hours, he comes home, he's physically, sexually, and otherwise abusive. This may occur on Saturday as well. Sunday, he's sobering up. Sunday evening and the rest of the week, he's sober and there's no physical sexual abuse. That is a clear pattern based on the person's gaining his weekly paycheck, and in turn, the person going to a bar and becoming inebriated. It's important to understand that when there's no pattern, when the harm that the asylum client has is arbitrary or capricious, is maybe rooted in blind hatred or psychopathy or prejudice or bias or racism, it makes it even worse because the victim has no sense of certainty or predictability. If it's a one-year filing deadline issue, and I've seen numerous cases, it's crucial to go back as far as possible in the person's life to understand their development and how the psychological issues have been long-term. I used to do a program, I haven't done it for many years, but maybe I'll present it on YouTube as well, for female genital mutilation. And I actually began doing that program because people are asking about the one-year filing deadline issue. And one of the things I explained was that these were victims in their country of origin who had suffered systemic harm because of the FGM, medical and physical, psychological, emotional, sexual, interpersonal, it goes on and on. And that psychological harm becomes a part of their life. And when they come to the United States, the psychological harm doesn't diminish. It's important to therefore understand how the person's lack of trust and inability to access resources, their lack of security, safety, stability, their personal vulnerability, how their identity and sense of self has been undermined or degraded, has over many years affected them, and when they come to the United States may well prohibit them from thinking clearly and focusing on what they need to do as a new immigrant to file an asylum petition. The kind of material elicited during a clinical forensic session can almost never be reproduced in the courtroom setting. I often say it's too bad that these evaluations that I do aren't recorded, or for that matter, waiver evaluations or VAWA, because it can really give a window of insight into the person's production of crucial material that they may be very comfortable with in a closed room setting where they feel trust and non-judgment and in a non-critical setting versus the courtroom. The courtroom setting is adversarial, it's oppositional, and it frankly can at times be hostile and threatening, and the person knows that losing a case can mean being deported to a place where they've suffered unspeakable human rights violations. It's important that, therefore, professional expression replaces self-expression. Just like the client goes to an attorney to gain legal assistance and input, so too the client needs to go to a forensic evaluator to talk to the person and to document their narrative and to reflect psychiatric outcomes that the person has experienced. Please be aware that some of these clients do not have a lot of education, perhaps the equivalent of grade 6 education or less. They may be illiterate. They may have very poor self-advocacy. So all sorts of educational, intellectual, developmental limitations or even deficits. And it's important to therefore, again, always keep in the back of your mind the possibility of a matter of MAM competency evaluation, and also that they need to express their history and their narrative in a way that's particular to their own vocabulary, particular to their own level of development. I also just want to note, some of these clients come in and they don't seem to present with a lot of psychiatric issues, but they have functional problems, and that's very important to consider. In other words, you might see a client who they say, I'm really not that depressed. I don't feel that anxious. I'm sleeping okay. But you see over a period of 3-4 years, they're either not working or going from job to job. They either don't have friends or very few friends, or they don't socialize. You ask them what they do on the weekend. I stay home all day. They have no hobbies, no interests. They're not interested in athletics. The functioning, the poor functioning, the limited functioning of these clients itself reflects something fundamental about how they're doing. It reflects their mental health issues, their physical functioning. In other words, sometimes you'll see clients that are not providing a very strong narrative about issues that they're experiencing in the United States, having recently come here, or even after years of being in the United States, even though they've experienced a very clear narrative of their persecution of their country of origin. Still, when you ask about their functioning and you understand their functioning is very limited, it really is a mirror of, it's a reflection into their psychological and emotional well-being. It can be very helpful to get parallel histories from family members. This is especially true in cases where the family member or friend has known the client since their early childhood. This is often very difficult because the client is here alone, or they're ashamed, or other family members are unaware of the case. If you're working with just the client, which is not unusual, you want the client to present a clear narrative and not to over-exaggerate, not to under-exaggerate anything. It could really be, if they do that to their own peril. You want them to provide something that's clear. Memories tend to be most clear when a memory is outrageous, and clearly if there's a particular kind of harm that the client suffered, it's something that's going to be outrageous and out of the ordinary that they will remember. Another clear memory tends to be qualified. As I said, that client I saw who had suffered years of verbal degradation in his home, but then when it happened in public for the first time, he felt a particular sense of shame because his peers were looking on, his classmates, and he had never experienced that, and that was a memory that stuck with him. And the third kind of thing that's impossible to remember are things that are permanent on the person for another reason, such as the person may retain a physical scar or physical injury due to an act of violence that the person experienced. Thank you. I hope this program has been helpful. I've been telling AILA National for years to carry clinical evaluations in forensic cases for immigration defense lawyers. Just to let you know, many AILA local chapters are interested. I've presented for them. Hopefully we'll get AILA National before the century is out to pick up on this. Otherwise, they're available in many provider sites. But I did want to provide all of these programs for free on YouTube for defense lawyers. Please do not hesitate to get in contact with me. If you'd like a redacted sample, I'll try and get you one. I think I have one on every program I do. And I'll, of course, have my email and contact information on the YouTube channel. Thank you for listening, and I hope this was helpful.